All right, Trump just made $5 billion on paper with his meme SPAC. Trump's social network has finally de-SPACed. It's now publicly traded. You can go buy Donald Trump's SPAC at DJT is the ticker symbol. They are on pace for a whopping $4.5 million in revenue on a $60 million loss. They're growing like 3x year over year. And the company is not disclosing any user metrics. This quote from one of their recent filings is next level. At this juncture in its development, TMTG, the Trump Media and Technology Group, believes that adhering to traditional KPIs such as signups, average revenue per user, ad impressions, and pricing or active user accounts, including monthly and daily active users, could potentially divert its focus from strategic evaluation with respect to the progress and growth of its business. So they're not tracking.
Isn't that the business?
It's so laughable. Like, I can barely get through it.
That's crazy. They said that?
Literally, they said it. It's a quote from their SEC filing. Wow. According to similar web estimates, Truth Social had about 5 million visits last month. As of Thursday morning, it's worth about $8.5 billion, same as Reddit, or close to 2,000 times top-line revenue. Company had about $300 million in cash after the merger. By comparison, Reddit has $800 million in revenue. Their market cap's $8.4 billion, or about 10 times revenue. So it should be about 5, 6, 7 times revenue would be more realistic according to basic media comps. Reddit had 2 billion visits last month with 73 million daily active users. That's pretty significant. The SPAC took a long time to close. There was an SEC investigation into 3 men allegedly making $23 million buying, then dumping shares of DWAC after the merger was announced. They all face at least 5 fraud and conspiracy charges. Of course, this is what happened before it was de-SPACed. And so, what do you think, Chamath? Thoughts on this
so just to be clear,
SPAC or stock?
I just think we should be really clear, because you're just floating this insider trading thing out there as part of the introduction, which is a huge allegation. And we have to be really clear that is related to a few investors and not to the company itself. And the company's SPAC was approved by the SEC. So I just think we have to be clear,
Here's
clear
the
about
SEC chart. Yeah, just to be super clear, SEC charges former DWAC board member and others for insider trading. DWAC.
I just don't think this is the story. This is just
this is the reason it was delayed. So just to be clear, it was this whole thing's been delayed for a couple of years because of this.
Okay, fine. So it was delayed. The SEC approved it. The company is now trading.
What do you think of the valuation?
And that's the real topic, isn't it?
Here's what I'll say. I think that this is a really important watershed moment, and it reminds me of 1997. Nick, throw this little image up. In 1997, David Bowie issued what was then famously called a Bowie bond. It was $55 million that yielded 7.5%, which is about 80 bips above the 10-year at the time. These were 10-year bonds.
That's awesome. I didn't know that.
The bond payments were linked to 20 albums that Bowie had released before 1990. And so these are like 280 songs. And what he basically said was like, listen, folks, you're essentially buying a piece of me, and in this case, my past work, and I'm going to take this $55 million up front, and you're going to get paid this interest based on the royalties that I generate off that historic library for a 10-year period. We think you're going to get paid the $55 million plus the 7.5% a year, and then I'm going to take back the rights. And if these bonds default, you will own the songs. And it turned out that it was an incredible bet. The people that bought it, I think it was Prudential, which was an insurance, I think it's an insurance company. They got paid. The bonds did not default. In 2007, Bowie took back the ownership of that catalog, of that back catalog. But instead, what he had was $55 million up front, which allowed him to go and buy all kinds of other parts of his catalog that he didn't otherwise own. So why is this interesting? This was the first example, I think, of people monetizing themselves, their name and their likeness. In this case, it was done via debt. I actually think when you look today, what's happening is a more sophisticated version of that movement, but at much larger scale. I mean, we were all joking that there was a bunch of meme coins that launched, not with any of our support, by the way, but with our names, with all these other quasi-famous people's names. Those things went up and were worth millions of dollars of value. And I think what this Donald J. Trump, the DJT company, what it represents is effectively a trading coin, a baseball card, if you will, a trading card via a stock on the value of Donald Trump's enterprise value, his name, his recognition, and his likeness. So this, I think, is the modern instantiation of the Bowie bond. And what's incredible is you can see Bowie, 30 or 40 years ago, he could have generated $55 million in inflation-adjusted dollars. That's about $100 million in today's dollars. Trump, $3.5–4 billion. I think it sits on top of this idea that these very famous people, the Kim Kardashians of the world, the Donald Trumps of the world, the Mr. Beasts of the world, can eventually take companies public. And when you take a company public, you have to remember, Jason, there's the revenue and the profits, right? But if you look at the balance sheet of a company, there is always a line item called goodwill. And goodwill is what people use to separate the assets and the liabilities and whatever's left over to generate the shareholder equity. So in this case, Donald Trump, the DJT company's balance sheet will show a ginormous entry in goodwill. And that is the value of his name. Coca-Cola has such a goodwill line item. PepsiCo does, Gatorade does, Nike does, and this company does. And I think there's going to be a lot of other companies that will go public that effectively generate a huge goodwill line item that represents the name brand value of the person associated with it.
So you're a buyer?
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there is a lot of people that will be buyers that essentially will buy this as a Donald Trump, a directional bet on the value of his brand. And I'm also predicting that many other individuals will go public and have enterprise values that are levered in the same way as DJT. And that is a modern version of the Bowie bond from 1997.
Freeberg, your thoughts on the Chamath's argument that this is a proxy for the value of Donald J. Trump's brand?
I think that's certainly one reason why people are buying the stock and driving the price up. And another one is probably a vote against traditional media, that there's a contingent of folks who are basically voting with their dollars and saying we want an alternative to traditional media and traditional publishing platforms that have censorship that we don't agree with or have editorialization that we don't agree with. And that this investment, I think, represents a way for them to vote and say, I don't want the old way, I want a new way. And while this may or may not be the new way that succeeds, it may or may not be a great business, and it may or may not even have much viewership or usefulness, it's a mechanism by which people can put some money down and say, I'm voting on an alternative. I want to see an alternative. So I do think that there's a flashpoint indication that arises from this that's more than just the memeing aspect of it, which is certainly fun. Everyone crowds into a stock price goes up. It's kind of like to the moon and so on. I think there's also this element of demand for alternative media. There's demand for a different type of publishing platform. And so I think that that's what this most represents to me from a what the market is telling us perspective.
I think there's one other thing going on here, which is that this represents a populist reaction to the lawfare against Donald Trump. That I think Trump supporters want to support him against all of these lawsuits and this persecution that he's been facing. And I think one proof of this is if you turn the dial over to MSNBC, they've been losing their minds all week over this because they thought they had finally gotten the man. There was this $450 million judgment in New York that he was fined for supposedly inflating the value of assets against which he got loans, even though the bank did its own independent appraisal of the properties, and even though the banks fully got paid back and said they wanted to keep doing business with him. So they thought they had finally gotten DJT, and he was going to have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. And then lo and behold, this SPAC comes along and he makes millions and millions of dollars. Now, that's not locked in yet. We're still in this lockup period where for 6 months, there's a very small float. And it's probably the case that once there's more shares on a liquid market, we'll find out what the real valuation is. So let's call the valuation we're seeing today, based on a very small float, let's call this more of a preliminary number. And Trump can't sell yet, but presumably after 6 months, when the lockout comes off, he'll be able to sell. So look, I think fundamentally what's going on here is this is political. Trump's enemies are angry about this SPAC because they see that it gives them a lifeline. And I think Trump supporters are deliberately buying this stock to support their guy and to say that this lawfare against Trump that basically seeks to imprison the man or bankrupt the man instead of simply run against him is a new low in American political discourse. And I think there's millions of people who agree with that. And some of them are willing to buy this stock as a protest vote.
I agree 100% with the protest vote. It's, he had, 60, 70 million people vote for him. He got 74%, 74 million rather, 46.8% to Biden's 81 million. But 2% of those people want to buy the stock, it's 1.5 million people. And that's exactly what's happening here. They don't care if they lose the money. Actual value of this company with 5 million in revenue, 4 million in yearly revenue. I mean, if you really want it to be absolutely insane and give it a 100x valuation, it's worth 400 million. And so then if whatever goodwill Donald Trump's likeness is, maybe that's another 500 million. But you'll lose a large amount of money, I predict, if you buy this. And if you're buying it as a protest vote, sure, go for it.
Why don't you, J-Cal, why don't you short it as a J trade?
I've never shorted a stock. And I think...
Remember Gabe Plotkin?
No, who's this?
Oh, remember from Melvin Capital? He thought he could...
He blew up his fund shorting GameStop.
He thought he could outsmart all the apes.
Yeah, that's exactly why I wouldn't do it. I've never shorted. I think that, you get these Trump voters and it starts going up because of the small float, which is what's happening now. They might send this thing to $80 billion, Who knows what is possible with the short float and a motivated, 1 million, 2 million people.
You guys are bringing up something else as well, which is we've shifted from fundamental-based stock trading being the overwhelming driver to there's a lot of very speculative day-over-day activity that you can't control anymore. And I think it's part and parcel of what's happening in other markets in America as well. So when you look at sort of what happened in 2016, when the Supreme Court said each state can regulate sports gambling, all forms of online gamesmanship and betting just started to skyrocket. It could be casinos, lotteries, sports betting. It didn't matter, but everything just caught a massive, ginormous bid. And when you look at the products that service the retail market, they've also become increasingly gamified. Robinhood is probably the best example of having built an incredibly good business by making things more like a game. And then recently adding fuel to the fire are things like 0-day options, which are just and there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal where one of the reporters, she became addicted to it. And the Wall Street Journal gave her, I want to say a few $1,000, but she had to disgorge the profits. And she 2,000x, or she got a 2,000% return or something. Speccing 0-day options via Robinhood. So the point is that on top of the whole movement to sort of allow individuals to monetize their own name and likeness via the stock market, which we just talked about, the second movement is that a lot of these things are becoming less financialized and more gamified. And so you just have many more participants. And so to your point, you can have a GameStop moment in any of these things. You can have these 0-day options run the stock to the moon. I would tread very lightly here.
Yeah. And just another warning, the stock market bases things ultimately on earnings and profits. And so when we look at this as a proxy, and Mr. Beast would have the same issue, or Martha Stewart, you have a key man, key individual risk here, i.e. this person goes to jail, they die, whatever, which Martha Stewart always had in her businesses. And then what is included in this is key. So if he does another TV show and it becomes a hit again, is that included in this? No. If he has another building, are his buildings included in this? No. If the golf course is included in this? No. What's included in this deal when you buy DJT is apparently just a really crazy social network that nobody uses. So just be clear what you're buying.
No, you're right. The more sophisticated version of this trading card analogy would be if Donald Trump contributed his brand licensing revenue in perpetuity to the asset. And then it really is a longitudinal forward bet on the Trump name.
Yeah.
And that's sort of more like if Richard Branson took the Virgin Holdco public.
Yes.
That's effectively what that is as well. Like, Branson over 40 or 50 years has built an incredible business. I think the stat that I heard when I got to know him was he's created 20 businesses worth at least $1 billion or more over his lifetime.
With the Virgin brand.
With the Virgin brand. And the Virgin brand is a licensing model where he holds that right and he will license it to you for a share of the revenue. That's independent of anything else that he may do with these businesses. And so if he took that Virgin Holdco public, then what you're buying is a longitudinal discounted cash flow on the value of Virgin. And to your point, if Trump contributed that name and likeness licensing capability into this, by the way, he could also still do that. So to the extent that this business saw a contraction and maybe the Truth Social thing didn't end up being that valuable, but the other aspects of the media business he could create by basically saying, okay, look, this will get a share of my licensing revenue for my name, would effectively be a proxy to do that. So he's got a lot of outs here to maintain this market value. And then on top of that, to your point, there's 70 million odd people who would want to support him in one way, shape, or form.
I would not go anywhere near shorting it, given his fan base is incredibly likely to keep buying these shares. And if you want to know the actual value of this business today, I'm an expert at this. It's $100 million. It's $200 million. It's not anywhere close to this.
Put your money where your mouth is.
We just explained. When you have a small float like this and a rabid group of people who are gambling, you will get your face ripped off.
You'll get
absolutely the stupidest. What's that?
You'll get plotkined.
Yeah. I mean, it's disastrous. I mean, what did they say? We can be stupid longer.
We can be retarded longer than you can be solvent.
Yeah.
The Redditors.
I mean, it's such a great line. I mean, but you can gamble like this on stocks, yet you cannot invest in private companies. I don't get the legal system in America. Be careful out there, folks. You will lose a large portion of money, is my prediction, if you buy this stock. But feel free if you want to gamble.
Look, I think this is all part of the ongoing backlash to lawfare.
Yeah.
Joe Biden instructed his Justice Department to prosecute Trump. It's, in my view, it's utterly unprecedented in American history for one president to try and prosecute, imprison, and bankrupt his main opponent in the political election. And there are millions of Americans who are absolutely disgusted by this. I think it's a new low in American politics, and God bless all the people buying these shares to support Trump. Just as a protest vote, I don't know whether they're going to make money or lose money. Like I said, I don't think you can justify the valuation based on fundamentals, but you can sure as hell justify it based on payback.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to give your money to a billionaire, buy the stock. Absolutely. Feel free. I think I agree with you. Like maybe 2 of the 6 lawsuits are a bit weak. I think the 3 or 4 other ones, he committed the crimes and he's just paying the price. But, we can agree to disagree on this pod.